Slaughenhaupt. Please rise.
If you would please be seated. My name is John Kliwicki. I worked with Karl for almost over 4 years. We met almost 5 years ago. I'm honored and privileged to say a few words and then open in prayer. My work relationship with Karl began over 5 years ago, and most of that time being a direct report to Karl. What started out as a work relationship almost immediately became a friendship. Previously, I became interested in shooting and began also to dabble in reloading. Well, Karl picked up on that right away. And so what began as a work relationship turned into a friendship surrounded with shooting, reloading. Many of you know Karl had great expertise. So this common interest opened up a world of getting to know Karl, his thoughts and opinions on almost any subject, his experiences and his career in the Army. I so admire and respect those who serve, and especially those who've had a career like Karl's. Karl also shared some of his memories growing up about his dad. He had many of his dad's guns and other items in his reloading room, many with interesting background stories. I told him it felt like his dad was in the room. And like me, those who knew Karl knew his great sense of humor. During those 5 years, I can truly say my esteem and admiration for him only increased. Karl had characteristics and personality that just made him a natural leader. Some people have this and some don't. Karl just had it, and he just brought out the best in people. I think being an Army officer just honed this God-given quality. I miss the frequent texting and especially the many hours at the range. He was a master teacher. We had great plans of continuing shooting together after retirement. I've not been to the range much at all since losing Karl. I guess it's my way of grieving. I miss my friend. What is good and most important is we discussed eternal things during his illness. And Karl did tell me that he had previously received the Lord's gift of salvation through Jesus Christ. This is truly what really matters and gives great comfort. 2 Corinthians 1:3 tells us that our God is the God of all comfort. If you would please stand and join me in prayer. Dear Lord God, we thank you for giving us Karl, whose life has uniquely touched each one of us. We ask that you shower your grace and comfort on Renee, Brittani, Piper, Kyleigh, Bonnie, Leeanne, and Eric, and the family. We praise you for your provision of eternal life through your Son, Jesus Christ. Amen. Please be seated.
A reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. For everything there is a season, a time for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to harvest, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to scatter stones and a time to gather stones, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to search and a time to give up, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silent and a time to speak, a time to love and a time to hate, a time for war and a time for peace. God has made everything beautiful in its time and has set eternity in the human heart, yet no one can fathom what God has done from beginning to end. So Karl was a man who was steadfast through all the seasons of life, through times of great joy and times of great loss, times of abundant love and times of emotional anguish, times of deployment for war and continued service and times of peace. He was dedicated to his family, friends, colleagues, and country. Karl had a way of taking care of business, and I also knew him through work, and I was actually working for him on a detail when he accepted the offer to leave the Bluegrass Chemical activity and move over to the Bluegrass Chemical Agent Destruction Pilot Plant, which we'll just go with BGCAP because that's a mouthful. And the excitement at a new challenge was all over his face. My office was just 2 doors down from him, and it was just visible. His face was brighter, he looked younger, he looked happier, and I even told him, like, Karl, you look younger and happier. And he's like, I feel younger and happier, because he loved a challenge. And he struck me as the kind of man who really needed a challenge, who needed something new to tackle, who needed to keep learning. And this new job was the next step. In fact, from what I hear, he became kind of a big deal at BGCAP. And apparently, he liked to talk about it on the phone, that he was kind of a big deal now. So loudly, he spoke loudly. So loudly, in fact, that he, the new boss, coming from outside the organization, so y'all know how that can be, someone a door so down started hearing a lot of this, and I was like, really, who is this guy? New guy, talking about what a big deal he is. So his operations director, Shannon, she's like, okay, she's not one to shirk from a challenge either. Well, she'll tackle a problem head on. So here's this guy bragging on the phone about what a big deal he is, and he's the new boss. So she just decided, you know what, we're gonna make this official. Runs to Walmart, gets him a gift. Big old sign that says, kind of a big deal. Gave it to him. Here you go. Come to find out, all those times she heard him talking about what a big deal he was talking to Renee, trying to convince his wife that he, yes, now is indeed a big deal. But I think part of what made him successful in the Army, both as an officer and a senior civilian, was his ability to focus on the mission and focus on getting the job done. And his colleagues shared how much they appreciated his leadership. And so I'm just going to kind of go through a list of the things I've heard from his colleagues, his coworkers, people who worked for him when he left BGCAP, people from BGCA. He's collaborative. He took time to talk with people and get to know them. He recognized the contributions of his team. He wasn't afraid to make the tough decisions, and that there was no one better than Karl to go to bat for you. And what you see is what you get, no pretension. He was very generous with his time. If you have a shared interest, like shooting perhaps, he would enthusiastically share that knowledge and time. He had a can-do attitude, he was optimistic, he was positive, and he led by example. That is just a brief glimpse into his life and relationships at work. But now I'd like to invite some folks up to share another side of Karl. Let's hear about his life from his friends and his family. And I'd like to invite his brother Eric up, please.
Some people were smarter than me and used larger font, so we'll see if we can get through this here. So thank you all for coming to remember my little brother, Karl. I guess no matter how old siblings get, we still tend to think of the youngest as little. And one of my earliest memories living in Butler, Pennsylvania, is how we all got to love on Karl as a baby of the family and how he was kissing soft. In his early years, and my sisters, Elise and Leeanne, and our cousin Mark all took turns kissing on him. As an Army brat kid, moving around 9 times in 16 years, living in Pennsylvania, Missouri, Texas, Colorado, Italy, and Oklahoma from 1964 to 1980, I think you develop a different kind of bond with your siblings as a mini pack, defending yourselves against the turmoil of moving from place to place, encountering different cultures, domestic, international, and the uncertainty of having your father serve 2 tours in Korea and Vietnam almost back to back. Sometimes the moves were tougher than others, but Karl and I often reflected on how grateful we were that our dad, Wendell, aka the Slog, chose the path of a career Army officer. In our annual sojourns back to visit relatives in Pennsylvania, we were acutely aware of the difficulties some of our cousins faced. But we had great times hanging out with our McBride cousins and devouring Aunt Lorraine's fabulous hot bread from the oven with butter and homemade elderberry jam, or munching on teaberry leaves along our hikes down to Briner's Mill Ridge, our bridge. We also loved hanging out with the cousin Mark Whited, playing pickleball in his backyard, our trips to miniature golf, and taking in some Pittsburgh Pirate games. We were not wealthy by any means, but we were given the opportunity to make ourselves better. And Karl pursued this to the fullest by obtaining his bachelor's degree at Penn State, master's degree at University of Central Missouri, and of course, he was most proud of his career as a decorated Army infantry officer and airborne ranger, with tours in Iraq, 2 deployments in Afghanistan, and continuing to serve his country as chief operations at Bluegrass Army Depot. Excuse me if I don't get all the acronyms right there. I have great memories growing up together in our weekend ventures with our dad in his old VW Bug or Chevy pickup. On many of the bases provided wide open spaces for us to explore and discover our treasures, which usually took the form of old rations abandoned in the field at Fort Walters, Fort Carson, Fort Sill, as well as rounding up thousands of blank M60 cartridges so we could set off the gunpowder, which occasionally resulted in some close calls and some singed hair. Another great pastime we shared was dumpster diving at Fort Sam Houston, as soldiers rotated out of the barracks across from our duplex base housing, resulting in a hoard of records, brass buckles, Playboy magazines, and an endless supply of cards and poker chips, resulting in Karl's favorite pastime for many, many years. We also had a baseball field across from the street with lights, and we played there together with all the other neighborhood kids in pickup games late into the night during the summer. This was heaven. We got to explore all the cool military museums from base to base, including the Quadrangle in Fort Sam Houston and San Antonio, and getting chased by mean turkeys and guinea fowl while admiring their majestic deer herd, or catching crawdads or perch together in the nearby creek. Of course, these adventures typically involve plinking, First, it was our BB guns along the railroad tracks in Shippensville, Pennsylvania. Then, of course, graduating to the 22, the 38, the 357, the 45, and finally, the big mother, the 44 Magnum, which just scared the bejesus out of us both at the first time we fired it in our preteen years. Dad had bought reloading equipment about this time, and Karl and I quickly learned how to cast our own lead, load hundreds of 38s and 20-gauge shotgun shells, some of which I still have today. With the Slog sharing of his encyclopedic knowledge of bullet weights, powder grains, and love of all things firearms related, Karl found his niche in his own passion. I was always amazed that what to me was Karl's savant-like database of information. Two of them would get together like Horace Smith and Daniel Webster, sharing their latest experiments with some new primer, their newest reloading die, or how tight their latest groups were. Throw in a Sky vodka martini or two and look out. It was truly amazing. As is normal, we had typical big brother, little brother challenges, and we had to share a room for about 10 years. I was the neat one, Karl less so, and he did appreciate my efforts to change his ways. I would have thought he was a reincarnated soldier with a barrage of colorful language hurled in my direction after some form of unsolicited advice, or I was reminded who his real father really was. In retrospect, it was apparent that he would not be a shy pushover. Karl would speak his mind, as you can all imagine. Some of our best adventures had to be in Camp Darby in Italy from 1976 to 79, where we lived just 3 blocks from the beach. Our high school had only 68 kids, 9th through 12th, and it allowed us to do a lot of team sports, traveling, and to compete with other military bases in Vicenza, Aviano, Naples, Brindisi, Sigonella, and a number of international schools in Rome, Florence, and Milano, resulting in some long and epic bus and train trips. Karl was able to come into his own and pursue his interest in tennis and cross country, and we got to share wrestling together one year. With American dollars in our pockets and a favorable exchange rate, the locals were happy to sell us alcohol, which, as you can imagine, the result on 13 and 15-year-old brothers. For 800 lira, you could get a slice of pizza, a liter of forced beer, and a shot of Zambuca, which, just the mention of that name, would turn Karl's stomach throughout the rest of his life. Once on a high school-sponsored trip to Berchtesgaden, Germany, during a quick stop in Florence, Karl snuck off and returned with a bottle of Johnny Walker Black Label and some cans of Fanta Orange Soda. He proceeded to mix drinks for his 10th grade buddies. Needless to say, this didn't become his favorite concoction. And he left a large orange deposit beneath the bottom bunk of our sleeper car. Amazingly, on our return home, 3 days later, he was berthed in the exact same sleeper car, and the deposit was still preserved there. These were great times. After returning from Italy, Pops retired in 1980. He and Karl went back to Pennsylvania, and I went to California to go to college. After the next few years, we didn't see each other a lot while we were in school, and even then, it was only once a year when we were reunited to go deer hunting in Pennsylvania when Karl was stateside. Unfortunately, I did get to see Karl grow up daily into the man, the husband, the father, the soldier, officer, and leader that most of you know him as. But I did get to have great respect for him, for the man that I knew. As adults, we were able to share a love of the outdoors and deer hunting with the Slog and his buddies, Bill Bester and Joe Victor, for many years on Wendell's beautiful 60 acres in Fisher, Pennsylvania, not far from his childhood home in Shinville. Wendell and Bonnie always made us feel we were home and gave us a chance to chat, to rest and relax. I remember one story he told me while hunting about when he was in Desert Storm, and a general came to him and requested a pair of desert boots, to which Karl denied. The request, as these were for his troops. No doubt the general was not happy, but that was Karl. He would do the right thing, period, not the popular thing. This was not a one-time event, and we frequently commiserated together about our dealings with those who did not share this value. And sometimes we may have had to pay a price for it professionally, but so be it. This is one thing I assume we inherited from the slog. There are few people on this planet that I respect for their integrity, dedication, loyalty, and love of the country. And I'm lucky that one's my dad and the other's my little brother. Karl wasn't warm and fuzzy, and he often joked that if it weren't for the loves of his lives, he would be a hermit in the mountains somewhere. Of course, I'm speaking of Renee, Piper, Brittani, Kyleigh, and his beautiful puppies, Gidget, Ruby, Maisie, Roxy, and a long line of gorgeous golden retrievers. So thank you for taking care of Karl and making his last days peaceful. In Germany, there's a greeting to wish a successful hunt, and some of you may know this. So I wish Karl one last Weidmanns Heil as he unasses this AO one final time to the happy hunting grounds of his choice.
Thank you. I'd now like to invite his sister, Leeanne, up to share.
Unfortunately, I had to make this a very large font so I could read it. And actually, I think I left my glasses over there. Did I, honey? So I know it looks like a lot, but it's hopefully not too much. The four of us kids, Elise, myself, Eric, and Karl, moved around from place to place, doing our best to thrive in uncertainty. We are a tough breed, us Army brats. Despite our ever-changing circumstances, we stuck together and adapted to new states, friends, schools, dialects, cultures, etc. You either adapt and thrive or complain and blame. And we were kids, so of course we did a little of both. In all, however, we have come to peace with our wayward childhood. The military brat motto is, quote, "Children of the world, blown to all corners of the world." But we bloom anywhere. Thus, the official flower of the military child is the dandelion. It can flourish in the best and the worst conditions. Too bad, it's considered a pesky weed by most standards. Elise was often stuck babysitting us. She had little interest in hanging out with as much as, and I don't blame her. We could be a handful. Eric and I were born in the same year, and Karl a few years later. My poor mother. The boys and I loved the out-of-doors expeditions led by our father. Inevitably, there were firearms involved and wild game to kill and take home to eat. Dad taught us how to skin these critters. I, however, did not participate in this bloody ritual. My brothers were natural small game hunters and proudly exhibited their prey. Later in life, they added deer and elk to their quarry. Despite our love for these adventures, there were occasional mishaps on these retreats. I recall that Karl accidentally shot Eric in the finger with a BB gun. And there was blood, more blood than you can imagine, as Dad dug out the BB. Fish hooks in fingers, cuts from careless knife handling, and razor-sharp MRE lids. Surprisingly, it didn't stop us from heading out to the next week adventure. There were numerous other close calls. A big mystery is how Karl came by his substantial wound in his forehead, which you can see in one of those pictures over there. The scar is clearly visible in several photos of us. Speaking of which, even then, his head was enormous. It just seemed to keep growing, as Renee will attest. There was also a narrow escape with a huge rattlesnake that we came across while in pursuit of some hapless creature. Dad quickly dispatched it with his .45. It was quite the trophy after we skinned and dried it. And yes, there are photos of Karl holding it up to show off the 13 segments on its tail. It was a monster. Karl and Eric took to shooting animals. jackrabbits, cottontails, quail, doves, and lizards, to name a few. I cried often as I witnessed the carnage, but I always went out for more when the opportunity arose. Despite personal experience with the nasty Texas insects, such as ticks, chiggers, mosquitoes, and fire ants, we did not hesitate to load up in Dad's old truck and off we would go. Karl, our baby brother, was never left behind. He was one tough kid. The three of us were a wild bunch and loved riding our trikes and banana seat bikes, playing in the dirt, fighting over the best Tonka truck, and forever building some sort of fort. No shoes, no helmets, and no fear as we launched ourselves into the air on homemade ramps made out of plywood and 2x4s. Perhaps that is how Karl came by that nasty scar on his huge forehead. As you can imagine, there were many wipeouts. In fact, I broke a front tooth and a face plant. Nevertheless, we kept at it. I'm pretty sure Evel Knievel's death-defying stunts were an influence of our quest for the big air. We played in the severe thunderstorms that were common in El Paso, along with flash floods and raging down our street. We stayed outside till dinner and then back outside till the street lights came on. This was standard operating procedure in our day. And again, Karl was fearless as he tried to keep up with his older siblings. He was destined to jump out of helicopters and head out to perilous territories. Eric and Karl were often fighting about something. I tried to protect Karl, but he was forever antagonizing Eric and instigating a combat of sorts. Sticks, bats, makeshift swords, rocks, and homemade nunchucks were his weapons of choice. The writing was on the wall. My little brother would go out to be an Army officer with state-of-the-art armaments at his disposal. We relocated to another hellhole in Texas called Mineral Wells, which Dad would refer to as Miserable Gulch. Yes, we were older, but still getting into mischief. Then off to San Antonio Springs about a year and a half later. My God, we were finally out of Texas. Eric and I were 16, which made Karl 13. We all continued our forays into the wilds with Dad, but our personal interests began to take shape and so less time together. Sadly, I lost touch with Karl's life after our parents' divorce shortly after moving to Italy. I was too busy with my new friends and playing sports. I eventually moved to California with my mom to finish my senior year of high school with intentions of attending a university after graduating. Karl went his way to college and then enlisted in the Army. After graduation with my degrees, I relocated to Utah for a science teaching position. Life just got in the way of our relationship. Years later, Karl did visit me in Utah to go hunting with my husband at the time. They ventured into challenging terrain riding our horses. Karl recounted the time that he rode my spirited Arabian Gallant and feared for his life as they traipsed around mountains and rivers. Gallant was a dingbat and probably a poor choice for a novice rider. Nevertheless, Karl filled his elk tag. There was much campsite celebration. Beer and whiskey flowed, and tall tales were enjoyed by all. Before his diagnosis, he was making plans to return to Utah for another big game hunting quest. This time, riding a reliable mount, an off-road side-by-side. I was so excited that he and his buddies would use my house as a base camp, and his friends are still always welcome in our home. More time passed, but we reconnected after our parents died, mostly through texting. We shared stories of our early life and mutual admiration of our dad showing us the ropes of life. We both agreed that he was tough on us, but it paid off in the end. We loved our animals, so invariably there were numerous pictures of dogs, cats, and horses. Karl adored Renee, Brittani, and Piper. His soft-heartedness for his family and fur babies couldn't be concealed. He liked his job. Life was good. I loved becoming reacquainted with him again. He may have been my baby brother, but he excelled in all of his roles and endeavors. as son, soldier, husband, and father. There was a sense of urgency once the cancer had been discovered. I wanted to share so much more, as I knew there was a time limit for us. Dave and I flew to Kentucky to spend time with him and family. I fell in love with his lovely dogs he had written so much about. My last visit with Karl was this one is I'm going to cry at. This is the one it's so hard for me, but my last visit with Karl this year was one that I will cherish deeply and forever. We had intended to meet up with Eric and attend a whiskey tasting event with the family. Karl had a serious stroke and fall, so we met in the hospital instead. He was pissed off and wanted to make a break from the hospital. So he removed all of his tubes and monitors and set off to find the nearest elevator. Despite the nurse's pleas, he would have none of it. My God, he almost pulled it off too. He and I wandered around the hospital floor looking for elevators. Once again, another page. Once again, recounting childhood stories of us kids and Dad. I will never forget our last embrace and some tears as we said goodbye. In my heart, I knew it was the last time I would see my brother alive. Now, this is kind of an interesting story that I have to include a little bit about myself, but in the end, it really shows what kind of person he is. However, it was not the last time Karl had deeply touched my life. In fact, I know with my entire being that Karl saved my life a few months ago, after he passed away May 5th. I am not a religious person, but I had an otherworldly encounter that has quite frankly had me looking at life from a different perspective. It's a very personal story. Some of you may relate to my type of experience, and others may discount it. I want to share it with you anyway, because it exemplifies the type of man Karl was and still is. I was riding my horse Hawk in a rocky stream in the nearby foothills in Richmond, Utah, which is where I live, where I had lived for 20 years. Hawk, my horse, slipped on the wet rocks and fell to his knees. When he stood up, I was hanging upside down and with both feet caught in the stirrups. My head was inches from rocks and rushing water. I knew I was in a precarious, most likely deadly situation. Any minute, I figured Hawk would bolt in a panic, and my head would be bashed and body battered along the way. I realized that I had forgotten to tell Dave where I was riding, which was always our agreement. It was protocol that I would also let him know when I left and when I returned. I figured it would be hours before Dave would become concerned and send out a search party. As a last-ditch effort, I called out to Hawk and told him to be still, but not expecting it. Horses are fight-or-flight animals, and I imagine his instincts would kick in any moment. I was waiting for him to take off in a dead gallop. Instead, he looked down at me calmly and stood stock still. Frankly, there was something else in that look, but I can't quite describe it. A knowingness of my perilous situation, perhaps. Horses have been in my life since I was a kid. I had never been in this kind of predicament with all my years of riding. It seemed like a hopeless situation, but then something happened. I felt someone take my boot out of my right stirrup, and somehow the left boot was released as well, which should have caused catastrophic damage to my knee. I fell into the water and landed on my side. A fractured leg, arm, neck, or back? I assessed my body and not one broken bone. A scrape on my elbow was all I could see. It was simply miraculous. Without thinking, I called out to Karl. I knew for certain he had rescued me. Hawk stood still as I shakily got back into my saddle and headed back to the horse trailer. We were both in this funny state of shock, but something else too. Horses are incredibly sensitive, and I think Hawk felt something had transpired for both of us with Karl. Having had time to ponder all of this, I see a bigger picture. Karl put himself in harm's way countless times to take care of his soldiers. He loved and respected them and wanted them to return to their homes and reunite with their families. He deeply loved his own family and made every effort to keep them safe and happy. I believe Karl is sticking around with a watchful eye, along with that nearly imperceptible smile of his. I love you, brother.
Thank you for sharing. I'd like to invite one of Karl's dear Army friends, Harry, up to share a few words.
Karl Slaughenhaupt was no ordinary guy. He was a great guy, and Karl was a very good and decent man. I'm Harry Tennell. I had the privilege to serve with Karl in Afghanistan during 2009 and 2010. Sometime during our service in Afghanistan, we became friends. He was a trusted confidant whose advice I valued, and I enjoyed our long conversations after we returned home, and I miss them now. Karl loved his family. He was proud of Renee and her professional accomplishments in real estate. He spoke fondly of Brittani's college and ROTC journey to commissioning, and he was excited to have Piper join the family. Karl and I spoke often of our common interests. Our fathers were both medical professionals. We both held a soft spot for dogs. And then there were, of course, guns. We talked about them a lot. And I was usually learning something new whenever Karl spoke about guns, shooting, or anything related. Hey man, he would say, you need to have one. So I bought one. What else could I do? Karl and I also shared a passion for military history. He knew his stuff. Most recently, he wanted to read about Army operations in the Pacific Theater during World War II. One of the books I had read as a young officer was by David Donovan. The title was Once a Warrior King, Memories of an Officer in Vietnam. I don't think I ever told Karl about that book. As I mentioned, we first met as soldiers. It was over the phone sometime during 2009. I was the commander of 5th Brigade, Stryker Brigade Combat Team, 2nd Infantry Division. We were posted at Joint Base Lewis McChord, right outside of Tacoma, Washington. The second in command position, known as the Deputy Commander, or DCO, that role was vacant. Karl was calling about the role. He wanted it, and he was volunteering to go back to combat again, this time with the brigade. We were originally supposed to go to Iraq, a part of the war that I was familiar with, having fought there myself, but our orders had changed, and we were now going to Afghanistan. Karl knew Afghanistan. He began to educate me about the war there. Specifically, Karl knew Zabul province in Afghanistan, which is where he had fought on a prior tour. And he knew part of the brigade would be in Zabul province. As the commander of the brigade, I don't even think the Army had told me that at the time. So Karl was telling me something new. After talking to him briefly, I knew that Karl was a soldier's soldier. I knew that as the DCO, he would be tough, courageous, and devoted to soldiers. So I told him the job was his. After talking to Karl, a little bit later, a few leaders in the brigade and we went on a leader's reconnaissance to Afghanistan. It lasted a couple of weeks, and Karl was not yet with the brigade, so he didn't make the trip with us. Eventually, we made our way to Zabul province to meet the leaders of the U.S. and Afghan forces fighting there. In one of our meetings, the Afghan brigade commander, a brigadier general, became a bit animated. He was excited about something, but I couldn't understand what he was saying. He was asking me about someone coming to Zabul province, but with the language barrier, I just didn't get it. Finally, sort of exasperated, he looked at me and he kind of yelled at me. Your DCO, he said. He had heard that Karl was going to join the brigade, and he was asking if Karl was coming back to Zabul province. There I was, almost 7,000 miles from Washington State, and this Afghan commander is asking me about Karl. I had not even met Karl in person yet. And this Afghan general is amped up because he thinks Karl's coming back to fight with their brigade again. Talk about a reputation preceding the man. And I'm thinking to myself about Karl, what is this dude? Some kind of warrior king or warrior prince or something? After the reconnaissance, we returned to Washington State, and then Karl joined the brigade. Then we deployed to Afghanistan. Naturally, I had Karl lead the part of the brigade that was operating in Zabul province. What else could I do? They loved him up there in Zabul, in the mountains. I led operations in Kandahar province. Karl and I would talk about operations often. During one of our conversations, he was asking about something. I don't remember what it was. I just remember remarking, "You do whatever you think is best. You're the warrior prince up there." And without missing a beat, Karl said, "I'm the warrior prince of Zabul province." And that's really how the legend began. We now leave this man's body and remains. We remember this good and decent man, each in our own special way. Goodbye, Karl. Goodbye, friend. Goodbye, warrior prince of Zabul province.
Thank you for sharing. I'd like to invite a friend and neighbor, Lisa, up to share.
I'm actually speaking on behalf of Karl's very good friend, Buddy, who regretfully cannot be here today. So these are Buddy's words. I am Edward Best, but I have been known to Karl as Buddy since we started shooting together in 2001. I'm speaking to you today about my hero and best friend. Before I go on, I must place this eulogy in context. I have very few heroes. It is not my intention for anyone to get to know about me or think I think too much of myself. When I call Karl a hero, it's important for me that you know that I do not use this term flippantly. I hunted submarines from a helicopter and was a search and rescue swimmer in the United States Navy. And I rescued 4 people in the Indian Ocean while deployed on the aircraft carrier USS Kitty Hawk in 1981. I am currently a police lieutenant in Temple, Texas, and I have been a police officer for over 36 years. I have been around many extraordinary people who have done extraordinary things, and I have had a few exciting moments in my life as well. So that you may understand the incredible love and respect I have for Karl, I will let you know who my few heroes are. Dr. Edward B. Best, Dad. He was drafted in World War II and was in charge of Filipino commandos who went after the Japanese soldiers that refused to surrender when the war was over. He then worked 3 jobs while going full-time to college and finally got accepted into medical school. Special Agent Mark Childers. He was the Secret Service agent in charge of President Bush's protection detail when he came to Crawford, Texas. He is a dynamic and incredibly professional individual who will still be my friend. Police Officer Jared Reston. He was shot several times as he was wrestling with a theft subject after leaving a retail store in Florida. even after one of the shots went into his face with a .45 caliber round. He continued fighting with the suspect and eventually killed him with his handgun. Officer Reston returned to duty after he recovered from his injuries around 2010. Karl Slaughenhaupt, an incredibly professional soldier who went to war many times and loved to place himself at the front of the conflict. Lieutenant Colonel Slaughenhaupt was the leader who said, "Follow me," and not, "You should attack here." He had no fear and was always ready for combat, whether in war overseas or at McDonald's if we were having a hamburger in Texas. Karl was a man of great integrity and honor. It was easy to know if he liked you or not as well as where he stood on any particular issue. I feel confident to say he was conservative and incredibly patriotic in his values. Karl's continual mindset was one of honor, courage, and virtue. He could not stand a coward. If he was your friend, he was your friend for life. I would go into an incredibly dangerous or life-threatening situation with him, knowing his great courage and virtue would never, never, never allow him to leave my side. Those of you who have been in these situations understand when I say that I know beyond any doubt that he would have given his life for me if it was required. I would also have given my life for him at a moment's notice. These are the reasons Karl Slaughenhaupt is my hero. In case anyone is upset because they thought that they were Karl's best friend, I will clarify that I said he was my best friend, but I did not say I was his. I know many people thought very highly of him, and I can't be the only person who felt close to him. I was blessed and honored to be the best man when he married his beautiful wife, Renee. Karl and I became good friends initially because of our mutual love of firearms and their accomplished accuracy under stressful circumstances by competition. It did not take long to gravitate to his outgoing and cheerful nature. Karl was absolutely fun to be around. It seemed whatever task he set himself to, he did it with full commitment and passion. He never did anything halfway. Whether it was firearms practice, competition, or war, he went all out to prepare. Have I mentioned he was my hero? I found out in March that he had been placed on hospice. I then took off from work and drove to Kentucky to see him. This was a difficult time for all, and I know how difficult it was for his family as I watched them care for him. Not only did I want to see Karl for the last time because of my love and respect for him, I struggled to know that he knew Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. As he is the way, the truth, and the life, with no one coming to the Father but through him, I needed to know that my dear friend was going to heaven. The afternoon before I went back to Texas, Karl had given an incredibly articulate interview with a retired general about his exploits in Afghanistan. I was humbled as he verbally documented his military actions in such a violent place, as someone else would speak about their last beach vacation. We then spoke of him knowing Jesus as Lord and Savior. Karl told me that he was good with the Lord, and he reminded me that I had already prayed with him before he had left for Afghanistan while still in the Army. I have peace knowing I shall see my incredible friend again when I go to heaven. I pray that all of you that know the Lord may have the same peace. With the greatest love and respect, Lieutenant Edward Best, friend of Karl Slaughenhaupt.
I'd like to invite Karl's cousin, Mark, up to share a few words.
Wow, there's enough steps. Did anybody see that rainbow last night? Well, I think that was Karl, because it was kind of a big deal. I think he was up there saying, I got this. I'm showing you my first big deal. So, I'm the cousin. I'm an only child, so I spent lots of times with Eric, Elise, Leeanne, Karl. And you know, somebody my age, I was in first grade when President Kennedy was assassinated, so somebody my age, that's going to be their first real memory. But actually, my first real memory was 11 months before that. I remember when Karl was born. And it's a shame we're here, but I saw that rainbow last night, so it's a big deal. Renee and I were talking the other night when I got here from Ohio a couple days ago, and we were talking, and she showed me his yearbook from Italy. Of course, I provided some of the pictures, but the thing that struck me when I saw those pictures of his sophomore year in Italy was that impish look. I don't know, do you know what I mean by that, Leeanne, Eric? He had an impish look from the time he was 3 or whatever. And if you take into consideration what he told me about Italy, and of course what Eric has told me about Italy, and other stuff about Italy, he had that impish look that like the cat just swallowed the canary. I think there was a lot of canaries swallowed in Italy. But anyway, that takes me to 2 years later. He did his senior year of high school in Freeport High School in Pennsylvania, and he lived with my parents his senior year. Now the thing about Karl is we were worried that he would graduate and grow up. But now I don't know where my teleprompter is, so I'm going to have to deal with this. Yeah, 2 years later, he and Uncle Wendell were living with my parents in Sarver, Pennsylvania, and his graduation from Freeport High School approached. We were worried that he would graduate and grow up. And by the way, let me throw this aside because it's also, it kind of dovetails with the rainbow a little bit. Karl graduated from Freeport High School 11 years before the gentleman who unfortunately died in that rally in Butler, Pennsylvania. And Karl lived on the same street. I don't know what it means, but it must mean something because they were both heroes, right? Anyway, Karl indeed did grow up. He kept that impish grin, but he became a true leader of men. And, as a leader, first you have to be a good colleague and a good follower. And Karl had those traits about him too. And I'm sure Colonel Tennell can tell us more than anybody. But that's partly why he became such a good leader. He was an officer of the highest integrity who developed soldiers that would fight anybody for him. Once again, for Colonel Tennell. And that's why he did become the warrior prince of Zabul province. He also became a good husband, always looking to spoil his wife, Renee. He became a good father. Helping Brittani become a soldier, an officer, and an outstanding nurse, and a wonderful mother. And helping Piper overcome all her challenges to become the amazing 16-year-old she is. Sorry. He was always a good sibling, but that's already been discussed by Eric and Leeanne very well. He was always a good nephew. He adored my mom. and he wisely memory banked much of my dad's wisdom. He was always a good son, but I refer you back to that impishness thing. He was always a good cousin. I had someone to pick on early on and had help. And we later shared our respective experiences as we progressed through our military careers. He, of course, was jealous that I was a Marine, but he did pretty well. My children and I were always welcome at his home with Renee, Brittani, and Piper. He was always a good second cousin. My son Jay also chose to become a grunt in the Army. Well, what can I say? Karl's example made him a better soldier. He became a sniper in Afghanistan, and ironically, his unit replaced Karl's in Afghanistan in 2010. My daughter especially appreciated Karl's humor, and she especially appreciated that because it was normally directed at her father. Karl was always a good man, and he'll forever be missed and in our memories. I'll be looking for another rainbow.
Thank you. So we have just a few minutes before we'll be heading out to Camp Nelson, but I did want to ask if there's anyone of you who knew and loved Karl, if you would like to stand where you are and share for a moment or two before we close. Does anybody have any memories they'd like to share with the group?
I remember one time when he came to my concert and he took a video of it. He was crying because he knew how beautiful my voice was. It was probably my favorite moment that I had with him. I miss him a lot.
It's beautiful. Beautiful. Anyone else? Okay. So underneath the battle-hardened and sometimes gruff exterior, Karl did have a soft side. And I saw it when he spoke of his wife and children. I saw it when he choked up, speaking of a dear coworker who was unexpectedly taken by death. And I saw it when he stopped by a gathering at Dreaming Creek Brewery to see the old Bluegrass Chemical Activity crew after his diagnosis, not knowing if it would be the last time to share some time with us. And I saw it when he took steps to ensure that those he loved the most would be taken care of, and he started planning his own funeral. And it's hard to process this kind of loss. Everything that led to this moment, the uncertainty, the hows, the whys, the what next. But my prayer is that all who loved Karl are comforted with the memories and the legacy that he has left behind. For Karl's co-workers, I know he relished the opportunity to serve in a new capacity in such an important mission, and he was honored to support us all. For Karl's friends, keep hiking, keep hunting, keep shooting, keep doing the things you both loved, and make sure you enjoy a martini every once in a while in his honor. And for Karl's family, I know he loved you dearly and earnestly desired to have more time with you all. And to Renee, Brittani, Piper, and Kyleigh, the Lord bless and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious to you. The Lord lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. Thank you all for coming and for spending time with the family and friends. And thank you for honoring Karl and his legacy. We will be heading out to Camp Nelson National Cemetery soon for a graveside service.
This does conclude today's services here. As you mentioned, we will be going to Camp Nelson. Anybody who wants to follow us over, just following behind the limos